I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In Depth, an interview program from ExpressNews.com with in-depth reporting and other resources for stories affecting San Antonio and Bexar County. 37-year-old James Preston Green has spent the past decade evading accountability for serial DWIs. And while he stood before State District Judge Ron Ronhell on October 24th with an already long rap sheet, accused of his latest DWI and also 2 felony charges of domestic violence, he would not see the inside of a penitentiary, with the judge approving a plea bargain recommended by the Bexar County District Attorney's Office that gave Green more probation and dismissed the 2 domestic violence charges. So, this is a detailed story. San Antonio Express News Metro columnist Brian Chasnoff says there are no tidy answers, but Green's good fortune in avoiding incarceration calls for an explanation. And Brian joins me now to discuss his work on the story, as well as some developments that have occurred since the publishing of this story about a week ago by the San Antonio Express News. So, Brian, you're normally a guest on our weekly podcast, Puro Politics. Great to have you here on today's program as well. Let's start with the basics. Tell me about the criminal history of James Preston Green, one that you found he has been able to avoid jail time for.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so the relevant criminal history really goes back a decade. And it was a decade ago when he got his first DWI, when he was arrested for the first time for DWI. Flash forward to October of this year, he's in court. He'd been arrested for driving while intoxicated for the 5th time. One of those cases had been dismissed. So this was actually, he was facing his 4th conviction for driving while intoxicated. He was already on probation for a previous DWI in Guadalupe County, which is a county near Bexar County. That was a felony DWI that he had received probation for from a judge there in Guadalupe County. And really the red flag for us is when we saw the plea deal that was reached in October in Judge Ronhell's court, wherein Green once again received probation. In addition, he was facing 2 felony family violence charges, and those were dismissed in the same plea deal. And this was unusual in that, he was already on probation, like I said, for a felony DWI. This was another felony DWI because anytime in Texas, anytime you get 3 or more DWIs, it's going to be a felony. And it's somewhat uncommon to just keep receiving probation over and over again. By the way, this particular defendant had a history of also violating the conditions of his various probations with seemingly no consequences. So that's kind of where we were at. Just the nature of this plea bargain that this defendant received in October.
So, based on what you just said and what I already mentioned at the top of today's episode, you think all this requires an explanation. Well, James's father, Jimmy Green, is a prominent businessman and philanthropist who owns J. Green Jewelers in Stone Oak, and he has a connection to Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood, at least Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood as of the recording of today's episode. Soon that won't be the case. So tell me about that connection.
Right. So for the record, the district attorney's office released a statement that said Nico LaHood had no involvement in this case. So, take that to mean what for what it's worth. But yes, Nico LaHood leads a men's only Bible study every Wednesday morning, I believe. And this defendant's father, Jimmy Green, who's a prominent businessman and philanthropist in San Antonio, he owns a jewelry store called J. Green Jewelers, where the defendant, his son, also works as a sales manager. Jimmy Green attends Nico LaHood's Bible study. And on the same day that this plea deal was reached in the judge's courtroom, Jimmy Green was apparently at one of those Bible studies. He posted on Facebook a photo of the district attorney leading this Bible study with a caption celebrating the district attorney for the Bible study. And I also have something to add that was not in the initial story. It actually, I haven't written it yet, but I'm going to write this tomorrow for Saturday's paper. Um, a video has surfaced. I was able to get my hands on a video that I did not have when I initially wrote the story. This is a video of the defendant, Green, after his latest DWI arrest. He had been speeding on Wurzbach Parkway 2 times over the legal limit for driving, his blood alcohol content. And he crashed into the back of a car, severely damaging that car. And then he got out and ran. The police had to chase him down, pepper spray him to get him detained. And Green had made up a story that he'd been carjacked, and that's why he had crashed. That he wasn't actually driving. He had been held at gunpoint, forced into his own car. This wild lie that he had made up. While he's being driven to jail, this was captured on the police department's dash cam. He says, the officer asks him, "Who's your lawyer?" And his answer is Nico LaHood. He says, "Nico LaHood's my lawyer. How about that? How do you like that? I'm going to call Nico LaHood. He owes me a favor anyway." So when obviously I wish I'd had that video when I wrote my first story, but taken together, that statement plus the connection between the defendant's father and the district attorney, it raises questions. Like I said, the DA's office, in their official statement, said that LaHood had absolutely nothing to do with the case. But those are troubling signs.
Yeah, wow. I obviously did not know about that. That almost seems like an investigation where you're missing the piece and then you find it. That's a huge revelation. So I'll look forward to reading that in the physical paper as well as online at expressnews.com. There are more developments we can get to, but I want to get to this basic story that you reported on about a week ago. So that latest case with Judge Ron Ronhell, the judge granted him probation, but he has since kind of deflected responsibility for that, saying that he merely approved the deal. So could you explain how that worked?
Well, the judge's position is that as a judge, it's not really his role to question a plea deal. He points to a lot of precedent that shows judges don't have a hand in creating these plea deals. It's really between the defendant's attorney and the prosecutors. And he's right to a certain extent. This is the plea bargain is offered by the prosecutors to the defendant, and in this case, the defendant pleaded no contest and received this deal. Of course, a judge does have the authority to bust or refuse to allow a particular plea deal to occur. But this judge's position is that he was not apprised of the facts of this particular defendant's criminal history, or even the facts of the case before him. His argument, the judge's argument, is that his role was to ensure that the defendant was not coerced into making this plea deal, and also that the defendant had a clear idea of what he was signing.
So that's kind of the basic story that you reported on about a week ago. You've already had that enormous revelation of the video and the specific by name mentioning of Bexar County District Attorney Nico LaHood. There have been other developments since this story ran in the San Antonio Express News on December 15th. I believe you have multiple kind of updates on what you originally published. So what happened?
Right. So I mentioned that this defendant has a history of violating conditions of his probation, and his latest probation was no exception. In this plea deal that he received in October, he had a variety of conditions. One of them was to not drink alcohol, which is pretty standard when you're dealing with probation for a DWI. Now, he was required to provide breath samples for 2 devices. One's called a Sober Link. It's a handheld device that you blow into. The other one is an ignition interlock device, where this particular device prevents someone from operating a car if there is alcohol in their system. And a couple weeks ago, he gave breath samples in both of these devices, and both of them registered alcohol in his system. He eventually met with his probation officer and admitted to having consumed alcohol the day before he had provided these breath samples, which was a violation. The result was the judge, Ron Rangel, he signed a motion to revoke Green's probation, and an arrest warrant was issued. And just yesterday, I believe, Green was arrested. Or it might have been 2 days ago. Yeah, on Tuesday, Green was arrested. And he's in Bexar County Jail right now. He has no bond, which is not unusual in these cases when you violated probation. And he's awaiting a hearing with Judge Rangel, who will now decide whether to grant him more probation, or he could also sentence him to prison for anywhere from 2 to 6 years.
Brian, I'd love to get your thoughts on this most recent development in connection with the response that you've seen, that you've experienced, from the research you did and that original story you published about a week ago. Do you feel like this new part of the story might have happened whether or not you researched and published this story? Do you think the story had an effect on what you just described? Is there any relationship there?
Well, I know for a fact that the judge, he sought this arrest warrant. He wanted to revoke Green's probation, in part at least because of media attention to the story. And like I said before, he wasn't aware of the facts. The judge claims he was not aware of really any of the facts surrounding the case or Green's history of flouting probation and receiving probation again and again. So it might have had an impact on the judge's decision to throw this guy in jail for consuming alcohol in violation of his probation. I think it definitely will have an impact on the judge's decision on at the hearing next month. It'll be sometime in January. I don't know what the judge is going to decide to do, but we'll have to wait and see if he actually gives prison time to the defendant this time.
What other ripples have you experienced because of this story? Has this generated its own sort of life based on just the ongoing developments of the story itself? What has that been like for you reporting on this?
I've gotten mostly positive response to the story. Luckily, very fortunately, Green had not seriously injured anyone yet, although his girlfriend, who filed for a protective order against him and who was involved in these assault cases I mentioned at the beginning, she has been injured. She was strangled. She had a gash on her head at one point. But he hasn't killed anyone. There hasn't been any sort of a seriously tragic outcome yet. And so I think a lot of readers were receptive to the idea that people like this who demonstrate a lack of remorse and an inability to control their behavior, despite being given repeated chances again and again to remedy their behavior, that at some point these people need to be called out and the system needs to offer a more severe punishment.
And then before we wrap things up, Brian, just want to give you a chance for final thoughts on this topic. It wouldn't surprise me, perhaps, if we talk about this sometime down the road again. And it certainly sounds like there'll be more writing about this in the Express newspaper and also online at expressnews.com.
Well, sure. I think at the core of this story is a system, a criminal justice system that really proved unable to deal with this particular type of crime, and this defendant who repeatedly committed the same crimes again and again and violated his probations again and again in different counties. His DWIs were in various counties, and in addition to that, the domestic violence side of this the alleged victim in those cases was subject to some attempts to control her by the defendant, and she vacillated back and forth between making accusations and retracting her accusations, which make it very difficult for the system to get a grip on this defendant. So it really, at its heart, the story highlighted how slippery a particular individual really can be, despite his history of being a serial offender.
And thanks to San Antonio Express News Metro columnist Brian Chasnoff for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.